So just, you've talked about the importance of education for people who could be victims of abuse. Do you think that our national reticence to do this sort of education, as well as cultural attitudes toward even like non-sexual nudity and stuff, do you think that fosters an environment for abuse or makes it easier? I guess I would, in my view, it'd be like, if you don't know anything about it, but you know it's there,
Yeah.
you're more likely to want to go after it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you grew up with it, oh, not a big deal.
Yeah. I think anytime if something is taboo, that you, oh, I want to try it, right? Do you have a comment about that?
Well, just in general about the manifest ignorance of our legislators
Okay.
about the topic. And I think it probably has its roots in the extreme gender imbalance in our legislatures. And also, as these people who got the same 50-year ago education about sex, which was almost nothing that I had, you have to have two things. We have to get the education accepted by legislators, really not realizing the importance of it. So the young people are caught between the ignorance and the law. And the law is almost the most ignorant part of it, the way it goes. So we need to bring balance, gender balance to our legislators, and we also need to stop being so fearful of the topic.
I think those are really good points, and gender balance is definitely a good point. And I think coming back to what you had said about like seeing things in the media and having these, being presented with something, and if we didn't have education about sexuality or relationships, that it's like, well, you're vulnerable. And again, I think that absolutely happens, and I think it's something that we need to avoid by talking to our children. And like, I was not exposed to pop culture, and I wasn't exposed to any sort of like kissing in a movie was fast forwarded kind of a thing. And I know the goal there was to keep us from something that we were not intended to experience for a good long time, but it didn't work. And I think that one way or the other, our youth are going to be exposed to those things. And yes, I think it does fuel the fire, if that's kind of what you were saying. And yeah, as far as your points, I think you thought you made very good points about needing more gender balance. And I do think that we need to hear the voices of, I think we need to hear the voices of more women in all of this, but I think that we also need to hear the voices of balanced, wise, discerning men who care deeply about these issues too, because I don't think that we hear enough of that. I think that's a really important thing that needs to change.
There's a TED Talk by a guy named Jonathan Katz that talks, it's a male who's talking about abuse, the treatment of women. It's fantastic. I use precedent.
It's really good.
Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about the institutional victim shaming and defense of the abusers and accusing abusers of lying, and how you might respond to that in such a way as to make it less likely that abuse takes place in these institutions like conservative churches and so forth?
Sure, I can talk about that. That's another kind of sticky topic, because I think that a lot of the issues in institutions like churches where abuse really can thrive in the shadows, I think there's a lot of reasons that it happens. I think that there's a taboo on talking about sex. Obviously, most conservative religious institutions don't have any sort of sex education programs or anything like that for the congregation, and it's more, abstinence until marriage. But I also think that the root of the problem lies in patriarchy, and I think that when any group of people decides or believes that they are dominant over another group of people, I think that maybe there could be situations where that could sort of be respectful in some ways, or it could like work out for somebody, you know, to each their own or whatever, but I think it's a recipe for disaster. And I think that, again, because most abuse happens at the hands of men, I think when you have an institution where men are in charge and men have each other's backs, that if say a young female victim steps forward and says that something's happened to her and that she's been hurt or sexually abused, it's a lot easier to shame her and silence her, you know, by painting her maybe as like flirtatious or loose or whatever, you know, whatever it is, promiscuous, than it is to actually turn and face the problem of why did this happen? You know, is there a mindset here that makes this more likely to happen, and how can we deal with that? And because those things really, you have to dig really deep to address those issues and to start to heal them. And I think, for me, I don't necessarily have this like really hopeful, like, oh yeah, you just gotta do this, this, and this, and then that's gonna get better. I think it's a pretty deep-rooted problem that goes back to some of the fundamental belief systems of some conservative religious institutions. And I think that in order to see real changes in the fact that abuse is rampant in those institutions and that it is also rampantly covered up, I think that you really, the word that comes to mind is overhaul. You really just have, I think that there has to be like a real assessment of their fundamental beliefs and ideas.
Well, I know we're talking about how we teach young men to act, and I study a lot of sociology. I am stuffed full of sociology. But one of the things that we learn is, you know, when little boys, we train little boys and little girls to be little boys and little girls only. Meaning boys can only be, they can't be emotional, they have to be strong, they can't show any kind of weakness. Anything that's feminine about them is bad. And that's kind of the society we live in. We view feminine as bad and not valuable. And so I think that's kind of why society works the way that it works, is because of this whole masculine and feminine thing. I do have a point. So I think one of the documentaries that I will suggest for anybody here, that it's actually on Netflix. If you have Netflix. If you don't, I'm sure you can steal an account from somewhere. But it's called The Mask You Live In. And I would look that up, and that talks about a lot of what our conversation is about today, is that, you know, we train these what are they called? This binary so hard that it's actually hurting a lot more people than it is helping them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's probably why it happens.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
So 50 years ago in Maryland in high school, one of my friends had gotten some girlfriend pregnant, and one of my other friends told me, said, well, hey, if we can find a couple of guys that will testify they've also had sex with her, she will be declared a prostitute, and then he's out of the problem. And this was enshrined in the law at that point. And it's also that part of the patriarchy, thing. You get, you know, we're going to help this guy out. Well, nobody was there helping the woman out. It became, you know, the person who becomes pregnant, all of a sudden now the law identifies her as a prostitute because a couple of guys lied to get their buddy out of trouble. And this still goes, I'm sure this still goes on today.
It's so interesting to me too, because this, you know, it creates this artificial divide, as Jesse was talking about, right, between men and women. And then how does one then have an authentic relationship with somebody who's of a different sex than them, if this is how we're teaching people to be? That law no longer exists. But the idea still does, right? It's just saying this idea is still really deeply ingrained in how people are taught to do gender.
I just recently watched the movie Spotlight, which is about the sex abuse cover-up scandal in the Catholic Church. And one of my favorite lines in that movie is one of the investigative journalists is talking to a friend of his who has been involved in the cover-up. And the journalist has just begun to really see everything for what it is, and he's horrified. And he's talking to his buddy, who's hoping that he can kind of just extinguish the situation by, I guess, appealing to his kind of like, let's just have a manly agreement here. And my favorite line in the movie is the journalist looks at his buddy and he says, well, that's how it happens, isn't it? A guy covers for a guy, or one guy gets another guy's back, and pretty soon the whole town is looking the other way. And it's so true, and this happens so often in our communities, and especially in our churches, that men band together and protect one another at the expense of victims and women and children and people that are easier to ignore and in positions of less or no authority. And I think it definitely still happens.
But it's not just men covering for men, sometimes it's women in authority covering for men, as is exemplified in the book Missoula by Krakow. There was, I believe, a prosecuting attorney in the city of Missoula, who was a woman who helped a man who was accused of rape get out of being prosecuted.
Wow.
And I would recommend reading that book because it also mentions Pullman in that book
Really?
as well. And half the book is about actual rapes, 4 case studies, and then the second half of the book is about how the judicial system, both in the administrative aspect and the legal aspect, dealt with those cases. Missoula.
There's been some research on the degree to which having female leaders, in the state that things currently are, how does that help women or not? And it is often the case that when there's just a few women, that they end up not stepping up to help other women, because if they do, then they're like, oh, well, they're the woman. Or the same thing happens with people of color, right? So like if Obama had been talking a lot about, civil rights for people of color, he would have been a black president, right? And he would have lost his authority. So as was said earlier, it needs to not just be a few people who are in power, positions of power, but it needs to be truly diversified in a variety of ways to affect real change. Other questions? So I don't know, are you going to stick around for a little bit?
Yeah.
So she'll be around for a little bit. I'm going to go home because my baby's not eating apparently. So I will leave, but she'll be around to ask questions. And thank you all for coming, and thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.